Well, thank you for joining us. My name is Amie Ferris-Rotman. I'm going to be moderating this panel on storytelling in the age of disinformation. All of us are connected to the ex-Soviet Union in some way, so that's very fitting for this discussion, as you'll see, and I'm sure you can guess. So I've been a journalist in Russia on and off for some years with Reuters and most recently with the Washington Post. I'm based in Moscow. To my right is Galina Timchenko. She's the founder of Meduza. She's the executive editor of Meduza project, which is based in Latvia, but which focuses entirely on Russia as an independent media reporting platform. To my left is Natalia Antelava. She's the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Coda Story, which is based in Tbilisi in Georgia, and is a single-issue crisis news reporting platform. Both incredibly illustrious journalists, so I'm very, very chuffed to be seated with them at this panel. So what we're going to be talking about is how to deal with this age of disinformation, which we are in, how to deal with this age of fake news. Obviously, I think it's very clear that we're all consumed by it. We all live in this world of fake news. Russia is absolutely the leader in this, the founder in many ways of fake news, going back to the Soviet Union. So why don't we start with Galina, who's going to show us a little presentation about Meduza, about her company. I'd just like to say, in Russia, there's almost no forms of independent media. So Meduza is one of, I mean, they are basically the leader in this. And of course, they're not based in Russia specifically because they cannot operate in Russia and do the kind of amazing work they do. So Galina, why don't we hand it to you?
Thank you for having me here. And I'll try to be as short as possible, but do not blame me for some details. You know, now I live in Latvia. It's a very huge country. We have 2.2 million population, tons of thousands of sea sand, the best environment in Europe, nice people, and I've been living in Latvia since 2014. So I represent so-called Russian language media in exile. But originally I'm from Russia, and the main topic of our discussion here is how to tell stories in the age of, or in the era of fake news. So what should I say? Welcome to homeland of fake news. You know, Soviet Union had been producing fake news for tens of years. For 80 years. Then we took a very short breath after perestroika, and then we continued. So guys, we are professionals in fake news. So, and you know, you recognized fake news in 2014. And we had been living all our lives in those environment of fake news. What is the result, to my point of view? The result is indifference or apathy among our audience. Nobody cares about news. Nobody. And nobody wants to know what the truth is. I've heard here, our audience needs truth. My experience with the Russian audience says that we have some special hook to grab the attention of our audience. So let me introduce a little bit about Meduza. It's very short. Can we put it on the screen? So I'm from Meduza, and we are 3.5 years old, and we have 18 million unique users per month, and almost a million downloads of our application, and the numbers I am so proud of. More than 70% of our readers, they are under 34, so they have good reasons and good chance to live after Putin due to physical reasons, for sure. So And this is our main principles, how to tell stories in this environment. At first, you can be serious. You need to laugh sometimes. When this situation of laughing is alive, there is no place to be frightened or to be scared. Second is bad news. People do not understand them. You need to explain almost everything. Then, there are no highbrow or lowbrow topics. You need to experiment and to engage your audience into your experiment. And so you need to be interactive. So how we experiment? For sure, we do so-called sophisticated or serious journalism. We do reporting, we do investigative journalism, but we want to do something we called double punch. For example, our investigator published article about fraud scheme of Moscow authorities, about environment in Moscow and so on, and at the same time we publish such story, very short story. You know, Moscow population is 15 million people, and Moscow Underground, Moscow Metro Station or Moscow Underground system is the main public transportation system. So, Moscow authorities declared that they will open public toilet in this underground. And this is short story. They opened it. After 2 weeks, they closed it, and after 2 weeks, they promised to open it once again. That's all. It's very short format. We do not need ask Moscow authorities, how do you think about this? How do you think about that? We do not need such story to spend our time and our resources for such stories. We have only 3 phrases, and we have double punch with fraud scheme investigation and very short picture. Next, our very special, proud is news gaming. So we do news gaming based on real news. You know, Russian Orthodox Church is deeply involved in all environment and all situations. They interrupted rock concert, they smashed museum exhibitions, they want to teach kids at school. So we made such a game, let the priest find the way back to church. When you played, you know, priest became running out of church. There is museum, school, cinema and theater, and you should tap them to return them back to church. If somebody reach concert or something, you lose, and you have share picture. You helped 7 priests to find the way back to church. So we made quizzes, but not quizzes. What flower are you? Or who was you at previous life? But based on the real stories. For example, we noticed that Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, likes very much 3 phrases. Putin knows, Putin does not know, I do not know, does Putin know or not? So we make quiz, real news, and you should guess what was the answer. Putin knows, Putin does not know, I do not know, does Putin know or not? And this is my favorite, you know, Putin is always late, and here, after he should beat Pope, we made this Super Mario game, help Putin to meet Pope in time, and you have only 1 minute to bring Putin to Pope in time. So, we gathered more than 200,000 views. It was one of the most popular game in our history. So, and at the end, Pope looks like a bride, you know, as in Super Mario. Other game is House of Cards. So you have to play. Every card has its own value based on the rating. So you should guess what rating, who has bigger rating than Putin, for example. Kyrgyzia, for example, Turkey. You play with the computer. For example, our lovely Assad. For example, Barack Obama. For example, Petr Poroshenko, Ukraine. For example, and you will lose. So, what's the main point? You know, you have so much chances to engage, to hook your audience, not just with so boring, big investigative reporting. You can do news gaming, you can do smart quizzes, you can do very short formats, and you can do double punch. And the last, I hope the last, is my favorite. Maybe we translated it to English, but maybe you will be patient for 3 minutes. We make a video about favorite phrase of Vladimir Putin, and now we'll show it. So, let's try. Yeah?
Yeah, it's not showing there.
Очень люблю, потому...
Sorry, the second window. Second monitor.
Please help us for a minute.
Not mirroring, no?
Not mirroring. Yeah. Sorry.
It's because it's Putin.
Yeah.
That guy works for the Kremlin.
Yeah. Mirror displays. Yeah. Thank you. So. 3 minutes.
Потому что она ничего не значит. Я ее очень люблю. Есть такая фраза, которую я очень люблю, потому что она ничего не значит. Я могу повторять ее день и ночь. Нужно всем научиться действовать в рамках закона. В рамках закона. Только в рамках закона. Вы знаете, я эту фразу использую по любому поводу, по любому вопросу и в любых ситуациях. Но самая главная обязанность – это действие в рамках закона. Можно бороться друг с другом только в рамках закона.
Великий Игорь Иванович Сечин, ведомости узнали, что он начинает строить дом в Барвихе.
Это в рамках закона возможно. Нужно понимать, в какой стране мы живем.
А Игорь Иванович Сечин подает в суд на газету «Ведомости», требует уничтожать тираж.
Если это в рамках закона, ну, я не знаю, но надо исполнять тогда.
Оппозиция может свободно выходить на демонстрации?
Конечно. В рамках закона. Предвыборная конкуренция должна проходить в рамках закона. Закона в тесном контакте с правоохранительными органами. Правоохранительные органы действуют в рамках закона.
What if we just go back a little bit?
Maybe. Seems to me I'm so tired of him. Okay, that's all. You maybe you may do your job not
В рамках,
with...
в рамках,
Oh,
в рамках,
ой,
в
sorry.
рамках, в 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 рамках.
Okay, okay. Can we try? Okay.
He's there, he's there.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
В рамках, 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 не переставая. В рамках закона, только закона. Хочу подчеркнуть. Я хочу это подчеркнуть. А я хочу это подчеркнуть. Хочу еще раз подчеркнуть. И еще раз подчеркнуть. В рамках закона. В рамках, в рамках, в рамках, в рамках, в рамках. В рамках, в рамках, в рамках, в рамках. Под конец. Повторю. Только должно быть все в рамках закона.
Newsroom, and we take one crisis, one big issue at a time, and we focus on it and we cover it from different angles, creating context and continuity to things that are often in the news but aren't explained properly sometimes. So that's our sort of general mission, and we picked disinformation as one of our topics because we genuinely, and we are only in the second year of publishing, so we're very, very new. But we realized that there was a real problem with the way that the issue of fake news is being addressed by the media itself. And we thought that there was a way of treating it a little bit differently. And I also have to say, we sort of thought of it before sort of fake news was sexy. But I think the discussion in journalism communities, in the industry in general around fake news kind of has convinced me that there is another way of thinking about it, and this is where we can learn a lot from Meduza and from some other outlets and just places outside the Western world. I often think I'm Georgian myself, and I don't myself remember, but there's a story told to me recently about an American editor who came to came to Tbilisi in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union had just fallen apart, just collapsed, and he was doing one of those, this very beginning of one of those trainings of journalists by American journalists, and he was taking to this newspaper, the main daily, and the editor-in-chief introduced him to the reporter, to one of the reporters, and said, "Look, this is, you know, whatever, Nino, and she is," which is actually a woman's name in Georgia. And forgot for a second, I was in Italy. She is absolutely amazing. She is the best reporter that we had. She is so good that you really need to read between the lines to understand what she means. And I always thought of it as an example of actually how horrible the journalism was. But in the Soviet era, I mean, arguably there was no journalism. But it also is an example of, you know, people had to be incredibly creative in trying to find ways of telling their stories. And I thought of it again recently when I was watching the press briefing by Maria Zakharova, who is the spokeswoman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Amy has a job of covering her in Moscow on a regular basis. But what Zakharova does is really no different from what Kellyanne Conway does, or, you know, the spokespeople for many authoritarian, well, she's not a spokesperson for the authoritarian regime precisely, but, you know, politicians do these days. That's the essence of fake news. They sort of throw endless kind of bombardment of information and facts and things at you. There's a storm of information, and then you walk away from it, and you sort of like kind of are confused. You don't know what is true, what is not true, what do you cover, what do you not cover, how do you cover it. The example, you know, I recently was citing, and it's a tiny example, one of many. She was picking on BuzzFeed, which she likes to do, and she said, "Oh, BuzzFeed, you know, BuzzFeed, we have sent a letter to the American embassy asking them, is BuzzFeed real media or not? And they never replied to us." And if you think about it, like, what do you do with that? I mean, do you fact check it, and do you ask, what does it tell us? Does it tell us that she doesn't understand the relationship between the American government and the media, and that's why they asked the American government that question? Or did they even do that? Did they send that letter? As a journalist covering that press conference, like, do you check? How do you check? Or do you just ignore it? And I think in that tiny anecdote, there is a real sort of a lesson in it. I think, you know, in like sort of in the Pravda read between the lines journalism, you would try to kind of reinterpret it. And I think in the media and in this age, that this is what we try to do. We interpret things. We interpret, you know, from Trump's tweets to statements to endless, you know, press releases, and this, you know, storm of information. We're constantly trying to interpret it. And I think this is where we kind of need to go more back to basics and embrace more the idea that what these people say only matters in the context of what they do. And maybe you do nothing with that statement. And maybe this is like one way of sort of dealing with this whole kind of fake news era. Maybe what we need to be doing more in the stories that we tell is moving away from the, you know, from what I see as really, really dangerous trend of he said, she said journalism, and actually trying to find, you know, what it really means for people on the ground and what it is that politicians are actually doing rather than saying. And I mean, definitely not reinventing the wheel. This is basically what journalism is. It should be about. And one, you know, last, I'll sort of give microphone back to him in a second, but, you know, a good example, the reason why I think it's so hard to do with disinformation is because we journalists are often are the ones under attack. We are being attacked. And this is where I think our thinking needs to slightly change, because in fact, I mean, in some ways it's no different from reporting on any other crisis or any other story, because we're often on the front lines of many stories. If you're covering an outbreak of Ebola, you know, you're also putting yourself at risk. If you're covering a war, you are also on the front lines. So we need to and it's harder to do that. And having covered the war in Ukraine, where disinformation played a massive part, I know how hard it is to sort of move away from and somehow not see yourself as a player, but actually look harder and work harder to find the consequences of fake news, the consequences of disinformation, because they're there. I mean, that is the fake news is actually a real problem that is really changing our world, and this is what we need. You know, when we cover things like pollution, we don't say, oh, the government says. This person says she's coughing, but the government says the pollution levels have come down. We don't do that. We find real victims, and this is what we've been trying to do at Coda, and I think this is something that media in general would be good if media in general embraced more, because I think that will, if we stop fighting fake news and start covering issues, I think that
telling stories.
That's right.
No, I think there's a lot of truth in that, and it's definitely become a lot more difficult for us in Russia, and indeed in countries all over the world, including especially the United States, to cover real news and real stories with this storm of information, as you say. And it's I've noticed it in Russia in my time there. I've been covering the country on and off since 2007, and the access to officials, access to, well, real information, to truth, has become extremely difficult and distorted. We don't even know what truth is anymore.
No, but that's not true. We do. We do know what truth is, and if we don't, we need to try to figure out what it is. And you know, Crimea remains to me a really good example of like how the whole fake news thing was mishandled and mismanaged by the mainstream media. And again, like I don't want to. There were plenty of journalists who did a good job, but it was in the early days, and where I don't think there was none of us. I was there at the time working for the BBC, and none of us realized what role it played. And when we saw the Russian soldiers, and we knew they were Russian soldiers, even though they didn't have the insignia, and we reported that they were Russian soldiers. But the way it was reported, the big picture was like, you know. But then Putin came out and said, "These are not Russian soldiers," and at first,
they are not soldiers. They are not Russian soldiers.
Yeah,
maybe it's soldiers. Maybe it's Russian. Okay, for sure it's Russian soldiers. It was five steps of lies.
It was 5 sets of lies, and it took it was way later than when he finally said, oh yeah, they were Russian soldiers. But the media, the Western media was reporting it, and I think Russian media is much more sort of, the independent media in Russia is much more savvy and much more skeptical. It's a completely different environment. But the Western media, because because it was reported like, well, he says these are not Russian soldiers. And what was missing in that case was a story of, I don't know, Alyosha from Ustina, Kamenogorsk or somewhere, you know, who was there, we never put a name and a face to any of these people, soldiers who were in Crimea. This is, you know, something that was done later by several journalists, but it was never done in the Crimea. And it was a really good example of how the narrative was muddied, and in the end they media actually helped fake news and helped the lies to kind of spin further just by repeating it.
I mean, that brings up a very good point, which is how do we operate in these countries and how do we operate in these systems if we're being fed false information and if we're not investigating the stories properly? I mean, could you give some examples, perhaps, of the work you've done?
I am totally agree with Natalia. I do not want to fight with Kremlin propaganda machine. I want to fight for my audience. For example, 2 weeks ago, it was huge fire in Western Siberia, city of Kemerovo, where 70 people were burnt alive. And none of federal pro-Kremlin channels give a damn about this. And we were the only big media who sent a correspondent on the field. And she managed to meet with the relatives of victims and with those special forces. And we published 3 reports from the field, and it gathered 5 million views. But unfortunately, we receive very strange reaction. For example, thousands of our audience wrote us, why are you playing on the side of Kremlin? Why are you hiding the real number of victims? We do not believe that only 70 victims were in Kemerovo. We believe that there is 300-400 victims. You know, this environment of total lies make people do not believe anything. Even trusted source. Just because of it, those initiative of Facebook about trusted source based on the opinion of your audience seems to me very naive, you know. But we could make investigations. You know, what I'm saying, that Putin is not the son of Russian universe. You know, Russia is country of untold stories. There are a lot of heroes. There are a lot of real stories with real people, with real heroes. But unfortunately, our Western colleague and our Russian colleagues put an attention, put a focus only on this Sauron eye. You know, what Kremlin says, what do they do? You know, there are a lot of investigations in the field. We have a very widespread net of local correspondents and local journalists writing for Meduza from Tatarstan, from Kazan, from Siberia, from far east of Russia. And you know what I noticed? That those stories gathered much more attention. And it's some kind of fun fact or maybe something strange, but those stories gather much more women audience. I've heard yesterday that there are big target for political news outlets to grab attention of women audience. So when you told real stories, women are engaged. They put attention to these stories, and they are very successful.
But I also want to add that somewhere in this whole fake news debate thing, and it's such a sort of hot topic now. The terminology in terms of sort of journalistic community, I'm confused by the terminology. Suddenly there are all this like fact-checking missions, but I thought fact-checking was just part of the job. Like suddenly we have this like or myth-busting, and not to sort of devalue the work, some really good work that is being done, but as Galina said, I think, and I don't think this applies only to Russia, I think it applies to the world, because it's so easy to get distracted by the noise, and there is so much noise, and I think our responsibility more than ever today should be to cut through the noise and to get to the real stuff, because the real stuff is still there, and the truth is there, and it's just harder to find it in the noise that is being generated.
I mean, I guess that brings us to the next point, which is, would you say that the shape of journalism is changing? I mean, as we're having to deal with, audiences which are perhaps predisposed to a certain way of thinking about, say, Putin or about Trump or, this kind of polarized world that we're living in, does that mean that the journalism we have to do is actually changing? Or do you think it's, like you said, that going back to basics, doing reporting as we've always done it, but that we need to do that in a different way? How would you say?
I think the formats are changing. I think, Galina just had a good example of, some very innovative stuff that they do, and there are plenty of others. I mean, at Coda we certainly are trying very hard to thinking of, of the story formats and how we reach audiences that we haven't reached. Normally we've been doing a series on Russians who are as part of our disinformation, and in line with our kind of thinking, we need to find the consequences of disinformation rather than just talk about lies being spread. Like, what does it mean? Like, what does it even mean that the lies are being spread? So we've been doing this series called that we call Jailed for a Like, where we track the stories of Russians who are prosecuted or are in jail because of their social media activity. You know, it could be a share, it could be a post, and so on. And we've experimented with, we've done it in the combination of a video and animation, and we have recently put it out as sort of as a graphic reportage, as an app that we built on an iPhone. You can check it out. You can download it in the App Store. It's called Coda Lab. But so the formats are changing. It's very important to be sort of in tune with the formats and some experimenting and so on. But I think the basics of the trade, I don't think they have changed. In fact, you know, I'm personally quite I always have been, and the trend has passed a little bit. But I've always been quite skeptical about what we called 5-6 years ago citizen journalism. I don't hear about it so often. What does it mean, citizen journalist? You know, like, what is that? You don't have like citizen heart surgeons. Like, why should we have citizen journalists? It's you know, there's certain basics of the trend, and I have to say, like, even you know, early on in my career, when I was reporting for the BBC, I always thought that what we do is pretty easy. But I actually have come to realize I've become much more of a kind of journalism, old-fashioned journalism evangelist than I used to be. And I think in that way, I don't think journalism has changed. I think what it needs to do a little bit is to slow down, because I think that's part of the problem, is that when you're a reporter in the field and you're constantly filing, it takes away from your ability to cut through the noise, because, you know, I've been kind of the live camera monkey, you know, so you stand in front of the camera and you just sort of repeat what you read on the wires, and it's important, someone has to do it, but you know, news doesn't break 24 hours a day, and this whole like 24-hour constant updates. Culture has changed the shape of journalism, but I think, you know, in order to cut through the noise, we need to slow down a little bit, and we need to go back to the basics. And the basics are basically doing really, really thorough, good reporting.
You know, speaking about changing of journalism, I'd like to say that I am very fond of idea that we are living in a horizontal world. We are not guru anymore. We are living in a horizontal world. With our readers, we are at the same place. So trust of readers based on knowledge. So we make some specific measures to introduce ourselves to our audience. For example, we have Telegram channel, banned in Russia since yesterday, but Telegram channel and our social media networks and Instagram, we show our inner life, our birthdays, our working, our special correspondence. We're talking about, they know, our audience know us in faces. They could trust us because we are friends, and our role model is some kind of close friends who can explain you something you have no time to understand. So it seems to me that one of the main problem that most of journalists, even in Russia, they pretend to be teachers or prophets or guru. We are not. Frankly, we are best friends with our readers. We want to fight for trust. And how can you fight for trust? It's a very long road. You have to explain everything. And this is no shame in explaining. You have to explain to your readers why you write about this and don't about this.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it's to do with peeling back the mask, isn't it? Like, there is this idea that journalists hold a certain kind of prophetic truth or non-truth, and that they're guiding people in a way that is an altered reality, is kind of extremely special, and I think a lot of that is to do with going back to the basics. Can you offer the audience here any tools? I mean, what are the tools of your trade in terms of tackling disinformation?
You know, we finally came to media literacy. I hate this word at all because it seems to me it's just common sense. It's all about teacher and pupil. I have no right to teach my reader how to read these texts or how to make consumption of my content. I just want to give an advice to maybe to follow common sense. That's all.
What about you, Natalia?
I mean, who are we talking about? Are we talking about the audience of journalists or the audience, our general audience?
The audience we want to get.
I don't think, I mean, I agree with Galina on that. I'm not there to teach anyone anything. There are people who do media literacy, and I think media literacy work is actually quite important. You know, I'm surrounded by people who said, oh, you know, this must be true. It was on Facebook. But it's kind of the same thing that people used to say about what they saw on television, and that's changed. So I think things will change. You know, I think journalists have always, you know, we see our goal as sort of getting to people by telling them really, really good stories in often unexpected stories that help them make connections and understand the world better, and hopefully that kind of and I think one of the greatest things, I mean, you know, there was so much talk about impact in general at the conference, and as someone who has a non-profit, I've become, you know, and have to deal with funders, and you think, you know, this kind of constant impact, and impact is such an intangible thing in journalism. It's so hard to measure it. I think the greatest impact, and it's amazing, you know, we've had stories of people being supported because they, you know, and donations and, you know, policy change and things like that. But and that's amazing when it happens, but it doesn't happen very often. But I think the impact that you can achieve that is impossible to measure is making someone think. And in order, I think that's extremely valuable. And in order to make someone think, I think you have to tell them really good stories and try to tell them in ways that that grabs their attention. And that's hard because attention is scarce.
It is scarce. High price. I mean, I guess it's a good time to open it up to our audience here. If you have questions for either Galina or Natalia, can you please put up your hand? Yes? Oh, sorry. The lady in white here? Yeah? Can you introduce yourself? Okay.
Mike.
Sorry.
It works.
Pro.
Okay.
This one is okay.
I'm Selena Mariano, and I work for Radiofonica, that is Perugia University Radio. And I wanted to ask if Meduza's site is only in Russian or also in English.
We have English version, meduza.io/en, and we have newsletters, everyday newsletters, and some type of content, and the slogan is The Real Russia. Today.
Thank you.
Actually, that's quite interesting because Meduza started out only in Russian and then you moved
only in
to
Russian,
English.
but we decided that it's worth reading.
Yeah, it is worth reading. I highly recommend it. And also, Coda recently launched in Russian, right?
Yeah, our main sort of edition is in English, but we now have a Russian platform as well, which is they're not covering. It's at our Russian team. They're not covering disinformation, but they've got sort of topics that they deal with as well.
So I think that's super interesting that they both of them are now in both languages, obviously because of readership, because that's who wanted to read your stories. Thank you. Yeah, the lady at the back.
Hello, Marina Lalovic. I'm a journalist. I'm working for the Radio Rai, but I'm with the Serbian origins. I'm underlying that because of the point of reference Meduza also had while I was working there. So I wanted to ask Ms. Galina, because Meduza is actually one of our sources when we are doing a foreign press review. And I can say one of the alternative media, let's call it like that, like the diverse thinking, while tackling the Russian issues. I wanted to ask you, who are your readers? Are also, of course, Russians as well, but are you able to know who mostly is reading you? And secondly, I wanted to ask you, who are your sources in terms of Russian media? What is the first thing that you read in terms of Russian media literacy of yours? Who are your sources? Maybe, I don't know, of the media and the radio, and are there any sites which you can recommend us? Thank you.
Speaking about our audience, 70% of our audience live in Russia, then Ukraine, then Belarus, then countries with big Russian diaspora, like Israel, United States, and Germany. Speaking about audience, I can say that more than 50% is under 25, 70% is under 34, and they live in the big cities, for sure. And it's funny, but we have Moscow, St. Petersburg, Novosibirsk, and at the 6th place, we have London. There are 300,000 Russians in London, so among top 10 cities, there are Londoners. It seems to me it's enough, yeah? So speaking about my favorite news sources, I adore Zona.media. It's tremendous project about human rights, and they write such interesting reporting, such great onlines from courts or Russian prisons or something like that. For sure, time by time Novaya Gazeta. For sure, time by time Ведомости. And small sites, something like OVD Info, or, for example, thevillage.ru.
Thank you. Yes, the man, there was actually, I think
microphone.
Actually,
microphone.
Yeah, we need the one closer to us first. If that's sorry.
The dance didn't work.
Thanks very much. I'm Peter Bale, and I work at Wicked Tribune. I'd like to ask you two questions, if I may, and they're sort of psychological ones, because I wonder, could you explain a little bit about why Russia is so vulnerable and expert at this? I mean, two of my favorite books are the David Satter books, The Less You Know, The Better You'll Sleep, and It Was a Long Time Ago, and It Never Happened Anyway. And to me, those kind of sum up a kind of Soviet-era wish not to know. Is that part of this that still infects Russian society, or is that actually patronizing? And could you just do a little bit more with your question about Facebook? Because I think this question of trying to do good, and we were too busy doing good to understand the bad, is something that somebody like a former KGB agent who can blow up apartment buildings with his own people in them is going to exploit. And I guess that exploiting that naivety of the platforms, I'd love you to address a little bit more, please.
Okay, do you want to?
They're quite big. We can do another.
The first, how Russia is both vulnerable and what, and something else at the same time. What was the first question? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Is it Soviet Union heritage?
Oh, okay. Where nothing is believable.
Is it a Soviet-era problem that nothing was believable then, so nothing is believable now?
Well, both of you were children in the Soviet Union, so.
Yeah,
Not me.
But I think I'll let Galina answer sort of as a Russian. I think it will be more diplomatic of me to let Galina answer the what's wrong with Russia question, and then I'll add to that.
You know, actually, I think that now we are returning in Soviet era very fast, And guys who now are sitting in Kremlin, they are totally Soviet kids and Soviet guys. They are ex-Komsomol, so Lenin's youth organization. They are totally from Komsomol. And that's because those post-Soviet ideology for real is new Soviet ideology. You know, unfortunately, we are dealing now with some kind of, you know, how can I say? I think what are my feelings about this? And I realized that I have feelings that they are stealing 20 years of my life. You know, for 20 years I breathe freely, and I could say whatever I want. But I remember how in Soviet Union I hide books not to read them in at underground or in public transport because it was Solzhenitsyn or something like this. And nowadays we're returning to these times again. You know, they are all, it's all about Soviet Union. It's all about Soviet beast we could not kill.
I have something to add. I think in some ways, you know, it's hard to answer this question without making sort of big sweeping statements about Russia, which is always obviously dangerous make them about anything. But I think if I were to make a big sweeping statement, I would say that the Soviet Union as a whole, but Russia is in particular, and it's hard, it's easy to think about it as kind of one homogeneous space, but it absolutely isn't. But I think one thing that unites the region and has played a really, really big part in its vulnerability and in its inability to get anywhere is the fact that, you know, this is Russia and countries that are around Russia, minus the Baltics perhaps, is very, very bad at burying its dead. We have recently added kind of a theme to our coverage of this information, and we're looking at stories about rewriting history, because rewriting historical narratives has been a massive, massive part of the Kremlin's disinformation campaigns, and sort of really interesting to see it coming up in other countries around the world in connection with the whole like fake news thing. And we're working on a film right now about Stalin and about just complete Russia's, you know, and people's complete inability to sort of decide and to have a consensus on whether he was a bad guy or not. I mean, this is a subject of a massive debate. There was recently like a fight live on television about it. You know, that's just one example. It's a looming, overwhelming example, but it's just one example, and there's so many others. And fitting to this session, I think one of the reasons why the place is so screwed up in so many ways is because it has lived in a one big lie for many, many years, and it's hard to make your way out of a lie, which is why it's important, you know, fits kind of fake news and disinformation. And if I may, the two other books to recommend is one is The New Tsar by Stephen Lee Myers. It's really good, but the other one is Peter Pomerantsev's. That's one of our editors' book. Nothing is true as everything is possible.
Yeah, lots and lots of questions. I agree with that. I think Russia is in the midst of an identity crisis of sorts, and I also think that's a way to look at it in a good way going forward when reading the stories. What about the other man, the dancing man who had a question as well?
The dancing man has a name, and it's John Sweeney, and I work for the BBC, but these are not the views of the BBC, obviously. I like talking to former journalists, or real journalists and brilliant ones, from the former Soviet Union countries, because you understand what's going on. There is a problem in the West, and in particular on the left, in America and in Britain and in other countries, I'm sure in Europe, of understanding what's going on in the nature, for example, of what you hear from the Russian propaganda lie factory. Mm-hmm. So what's your advice, Galina and Natalia, to, for example, the British leader of the opposition on the credibility of the Russian state's line, for example, on the Skripal poisoning or the poison gas attack in Syria? How would you, your brave soldiers in this disinformation war, what would you say to these people? Question, but there we go.
It's a very, very, very tough question, but what can I say? Unfortunately, I'm Russian, and it means that I'm a little bit cynical. Part of Putin lives inside every Russian. You know, if you want to understand what is going on, let's pretend that you are the most cynical liar in the world. And from this perspective, you have a chance to understand what is going on. Do not believe your eyes. Believe just in their movements and their actions, because every word is a lie, unfortunately.
I don't necessarily have advice, but I would say the one thing that really worries me about the what I see in Western societies is sort of very deep whataboutism, kind of a whataboutism pandemic. We did a piece recently where we talked to about 100 RT watchers in Britain and in the United States, kind of trying to figure out what is it, why is it that they tune in. And the number one reason for it was why they watched the RT was the Iraq War. So they said they lied to us. You know, the Western media, the perceived Western media, you know, they say I feel they lied. The Western media lied to me about Iraq. My government lied to me about Iraq. So now I watch RT. And that's really dangerous. I don't know what you do about that, but I think those false comparisons are incredibly counterproductive and very, very dangerous for Western society. I mean, I don't think there's much we can do for Russia, but for Western society, I think that whataboutism is very dangerous, and I think it's something everyone should be more aware of. But
sorry, and yeah, there was someone back there. Sorry.
So. I beg your pardon for not standing up. My kid is sleeping here.
Wow.
My name is Hannes, and I'm a technology reporter from Switzerland. And I got a fair amount of requests from Russia concerning stories that I had written. And some of them were from Channel 4 and Channel 1 and Sputnik, amongst others. And I found it very hard to judge how to best engage with these requests for interviews. Because I have to kind of protect the integrity of my stories. And so I would wonder about your recommendation. I think I was on Meduza too.
Well, Meduza's not the dark side, but it sounds like you got plenty of requests from the dark side. I don't know, do you want to?
I'm quite curious about what Galina will say. I say do not talk to the Russian state media. Simple.
The same.
Okay. Yes, on the front row, very quickly. Yep. Sorry, we're running out of time, but yeah.
2 minutes.
Marina Callan from the Centre for Investigative Journalism in London. Why does Putin rig elections, crush opposition? Does he really think he wouldn't win?
Oh, that's a complicated, long. I mean,
it's
requires
to
long
make
answer.
a long story short, he does not believe in anybody and in anything. And it's not, you know, it's collective Putin. It's not just one Putin who said, let's smash the opposition. Yeah. There is a lot of guys who want to do something to maybe for their political or administrative careers.
To prove themselves.
To prove themselves, yes.
He's
It's
not
some kind of collective Putin.
I think the idea that Putin is this slick machinator who controls everything, master chess player, is completely overblown, and it's something that the Western media has created, and it also benefits him as well. It feeds into a lot of what goes on there. You had a question? Oh, no time? Okay. Oh, sorry. We'll have to do it. Come up to us individually.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.